Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you here with us today. This is our Cox Campus year-long learning journey. And the Cox Campus Way is rooted in 5 core values. We want to make sure that your experience with us today is rewarding, that it's empowering, that it's connecting, that it is safe and welcoming, and that it's essential that we're sharing research. We're always rooted in the research. So our hope is that you would experience these values today and that this would be a positive experience for you as you join us. So as we mentioned with the poll, if you are new to Cox Campus, if you don't already have a membership, please go ahead and make a membership. Joining is quick, it's easy, it's free. You get access to all of our courses, all of the resources that we'll be sharing today. And we're going to share a link in the chat. And before we begin, we also want to introduce ourselves. So my name is Alistair Smick. I am a content creator and instructional designer. I actually think I'm wearing the sweater that I'm wearing in my picture today. So you can really make sure that you know it's me. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to the lovely Anisha.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anisha Donald, and I'm also a content creator and instructional designer at Rollins.
And I'm Sally Edwards. I'm also a content creator and instructional designer at Rollins, and I am currently working on our partnership with the Georgia Department of Education, and I'm seeing a lot of partners in the room, which is really exciting. So welcome to everyone.
And I also want to introduce you to 2 very important people that are making things happen behind the scenes. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat. McKinney Coleman and Toki Vyas. They are both helping with tech and moderating the chat today. So please reach out if you have any questions throughout. Today, please feel free to ask any questions, but we also encourage you to participate throughout the session. We want this to be interactive. So if it's coming off mute or writing in the chat, our hope is that we would all be able to engage with each other and that the session would be a valuable experience for you. Today, our session goals are to understand the rationale behind using sound walls versus word walls, and to explore how to use sound walls as part of a language-focused classroom environment. So if you were with us for our last session, we were focusing more on the talk ladder, and today we will be talking a little bit more about sound walls to make the speech to print approach actualized in the classroom. So to start off today with that speech to print approach in mind, I'm going to give you a little challenge. So by the end of this slide, I want you to try to have your own response to the question, why are the speech sounds or phonemes of our language so important? So you can see that question in the little circle on the top right of this slide. So be thinking of that as we go through some of the information on this slide. We're going to start by talking about oral language. When we think of oral language, I think a lot of times the emphasis is on conversations or building vocabulary. But as you can see on the chart that we have on this screen, we can also share this resource in the chat, our components of oral language. There are many components involved, and it all begins with the smallest unit of spoken sound, or the phoneme. So we call the language system of speech sounds or phonemes phonology. And phonemes or speech sounds are so important that without them, we can't read and can't write. If you think about it, letters or graphemes don't carry meaning if they're not connected back to the speech sounds or phonemes, and ultimately our oral language system. For example, if you were to see the words on a page D, O, and G, they're symbols if they don't connect back to the sounds or phonemes that can be blended together into a word. And because each of those letters does connect to a phoneme, we can blend D, O, and G together with those sounds to make the word dog. And our brain is then able to process the meaning of the word dog by connecting it back to our language system. So those phonemes are important because they're providing the meaning behind the symbols on the page. And one change in a phoneme can impact the meaning of the entire word. So for example, our word that we just talked about was D-O-G with the phonemes D, A, G. If we changed the D to a J, then we would have the word jog, and that has an entirely different meaning. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she is learning to talk right now, and it's interesting to hear her learn that she is slowly attaching meaning to these phonemes. Sometimes she still likes to just say whatever phonemes come to mind, and I know she's attributing meaning to it, but she is slowly combining them in those meaningful combinations for our oral language system that will ultimately be mapped onto letters. So this is why when we say the speech to print approach, it's so important, because we map our knowledge of those phonemes or the speech sounds onto letters and ultimately give words meaning. So this means that readers, or students as readers, have to be able to hear those individual speech sounds, and we have to be able to warm their ear up for what the eye will see on print. And this ultimately is called phonemic awareness. So again, without phonemes, we can't connect the symbols on the page to our oral language system to read and write words. So before we go to the next slide, I want to go back to the challenge at the beginning of this slide. If you can enter in the chat your response to why are the sounds or phonemes of our language so important in your own words. If it's easier for you to come off mute, you can do that as well. So why are the sounds or phonemes in our language so important? Does anyone want to come off mute and share? They form the basis for reading. Thank you, Ben. All right, so I'm going to go into the next slide. Actually, it helps develop the brain. It primes the brain for how we learn to read. So those phonemes or those sounds are so critical that research actually estimates 80% of children who struggle to read struggle with phonemic awareness, which is a huge statement, meaning the vast majority of reading difficulties we can trace back to that importance of the speech sound or the phoneme. And we, as teachers and with our students, we need to explicitly connect the oral language to phonology and teach the 44 phonemes or the 44 speech sounds that comprise words in our oral language system and how to pronounce them or how to articulate those sounds. And we're going to go much more into that in our session today. We'll also share a link in the chat to a video going through each of those 44 phonemes and what it looks like, the articulatory features as you're saying it, each of those phonemes in the chat. So now I'm going to hand it off to the lovely Anisha for us to start talking about sound walls and word walls and what this looks like in the classroom.
Thank you, Alistair. So before I get started, I did want to highlight a few more responses that you got in the chat, Alistair. Ashley talking about learning how to read. Alicia, they give meaning to letters to understand words, connecting to reading. Awesome. And I believe it's Delisha. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They provide meaning behind the symbols on the page. So thank you so much for engaging with us. We appreciate it. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the two primary tools that are often used with beginning readers to support them in the classroom, which are sound walls and word walls. So looking at the word, let's talk about the word wall for just a second, right? And I want you all to kind of think about this tool and think about what you notice about this tool. Hopefully many of us are familiar with word walls. Maybe we've used them in our classroom. Maybe we're currently using them in our classroom. And so I just want you to take a moment and feel free to respond in the chat to thinking about word walls. How are they organized? How do students use them? How might they be helpful or confusing for early readers when we think about word? It kind of comes to mind for you when we're talking about word walls. You feel free to share that in the chat, or if anybody wants to come off of mute, they can do that as well. But let's just take a moment to think about word walls and what we notice about them. We always like to save space for anyone who wants to respond. I'm sorry, was somebody going to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Jordan Elms. I'm not going to look at you because I'm driving down the road.
Oh.
But a word wall is typically organized by, words are organized by their first letter. So like the word about would fall under the letter A,
Yes.
which can be very confusing for students because the word about does not start with the A sound. So they're not truly effective, in my opinion. So
yes. Absolutely, Jordan. Yes, and as McKinney said, please be careful. We're so glad you're here, but please be careful as you're driving. Thank you so much for engaging with us, though. But absolutely, yes, Jordan.
yeah, I'm not going to look at you.
Okay. You're absolutely correct. Absolutely. Let's see. In the chat, we have word walls are rooted on memorization. They're organized in alphabetical order. They're organized by the beginning letter. They can be misleading. For example, the words doesn't sound like the short or long vowel A. Absolutely. They often include sight words. Hey, Justin, thanks for joining us. Excellent. Very, very good. So when it comes to word walls, yes, they're organized. Typically, they're organized, obviously, by the letters using all the 26 letters of the alphabet, right? There's typically like a print to speech approach. So the instruction begins with the letter and then it's associated with a sound. Oftentimes, as somebody said, it includes high frequency words, sometimes even content words, and it usually focuses kind of just on one word. All right, so now let's think about sound walls. So when we're thinking about sound walls, what do you notice about sound walls? Again, if maybe you already have a sound wall in your classroom or you've been hearing a little bit about sound walls, it's piqued your interest a little bit. Looking at the picture that's on the screen, what do you notice? How is this tool organized? How might students be able to use this tool? Could this be helpful or confusing for early readers? What are some of your thoughts about sound walls? Helps with decoding. It's an actual tool. Kathy, I love that. Articulation, excellent. Love that as well. Great, great, great. So when it comes to sound walls, you will notice that sound walls are organized by sounds or phonemes, as Alistair mentioned earlier, and articulation. And it is, instead of a print to speech approach, it is a speech to print approach. So that means the instruction begins with the phoneme and emphasizes the articulation. So we're looking at how the mouth looks and feels so that students can speak clearly and precisely. There's also, with sound walls, they include like keywords for spelling purposes. Sound walls begin with the sound and then they connect the sound to a word, right? Helping students to be able to make that speech to print connection for spelling purposes. And unlike the word wall that tends to focus on that one word, sound walls focus on skills that can transfer to multiple words, right? So sound walls focus on those phonemes. They focus on the articulations. They focus on the grapheme and phoneme correspondence or phoneme grapheme correspondence. So there are a lot of skills that a sound wall will focus on in order for students to be able to transfer those skills to multiple words. All right, so let's move on and talk just a little bit more about word walls and kind of some of the drawbacks that they tend to have, right? So let's look at the sounds that are represented by the letter A here. And I believe someone stated earlier. So when I read all of these words, all, at, any, am, ate, about, are, away, what do you notice, right? Thinking about the different sounds that the letter A represents on this word wall. We have ah, we have a, we have ah, right? And so students could definitely have a difficult time knowing where to find the word on the word wall based on its pronunciation because of the different sounds that the A represents on this word wall. Let's go to the next one. And also when we think about shapes, right? So we're still talking about word walls, and now we're talking about shapes. And we're maybe trying to find a word that has maybe tall letters in it or something of that nature. And so that tends to kind of become a guessing game for students rather than actual practice, because the students are kind of just guessing and looking at the shapes and seeing, which shapes they can find. And so we want to definitely drive home the point that we decode by sounds, right? We're not decoding by the shapes of each letter. So again, we tend to see word walls that are kind of organized by these shapes, and it really is just, it's not useful for students in any way. And so we need to make sure that we are focusing on those phonemes, those sounds that students are able to decode. So one caveat that we also want to say here when we're talking about word walls, Toki, you can go ahead to the next slide, is that we sometimes when we say word walls, we don't want people to mistake those for vocabulary word walls, right? Because if you've taken our oral language course or our vocabulary course, then you already know that we recommend using picture cards for vocabulary instruction. So we love vocabulary word walls. We don't want you to stop doing those. When we say word walls, for the purpose of our session today, we're talking about word walls that teachers commonly use to display high frequency words. So we don't want you to stop using your vocabulary word walls. We're only talking about word walls with high frequency words. So we do want to just make sure we kind of clarify that for everyone. All right, so now let's move into how the Cox Campus Sound Wall works. Makini is going to be sharing a couple of links in the chat, and these are the links to our sound walls. And so when you are introducing a phoneme on the sound wall, you always start with the sound, right? So we start with the sound, focusing on the articulatory features. So, and when I say articulatory features, I mean, what is your mouth doing, right? So the way the mouth looks and feels when you're saying the sound. And this is a perfect opportunity where you can use mirrors to emphasize this. Sally's going to talk a little bit more about that a little later. So you always start with introducing the sound and the articulatory features. And one thing that I want to emphasize here is when we focus on those, focus on the articulation, it makes the instruction more multisensory, and it also helps with students being able to kind of distinguish between those different sounds because they're able to see and feel what their mouth is doing when they're making that particular sound. So starting out with introducing that sound, looking at the way the mouth is shaped, and then we introduce the grapheme. So this is where we bring in that keyword that connects the sound to a word, right? And so when you're looking at the slide, at the top, you see the first card where the first arrow is pointing. You have the mouth, the picture of the mouth, and then you have kind of that keyword there that you're using to introduce the sound and the articulatory features. And then you attach that sound to a word where you that represents the sound, where you teach in the separate card at the bottom, which is where you're attaching it to a grapheme. So we always start with the sound and then we attach it to a word. And so the goal is for children, is for children to use the sound wall to spell. So if they can hear the sound and they can match it to a keyword, in this case, shoes, they can find the spelling of that sound. That's always the ultimate goal when we talk about sound walls. All right, so then moving on, another thing that we want to kind of highlight here is that when you have a sound wall, it should be built sound by sound following a phonics scope and sequence. And Makini is going to be dropping another link to our phoneme grapheme chart. And so we want to emphasize here, when you introduce the sound, you have multiple graphemes that connect to that sound. You're not introducing every single grapheme at once. You're introducing the sound, and then you're going to introduce each grapheme that matches that sound one at a time. That's really important. And you can either do this by adding the grapheme cards as you introduce them, right? Or you can put the grapheme cards up and you can cover them, like covering them with maybe sticky notes, and then you uncover each grapheme as you introduce it. So, there's more than one way to do it. The most important thing is making sure that you are introducing the graphemes one at a time. And the link that McKinney shared in the chat, it follows the sequence of our 44 phonemes video that Alistair talked about earlier that we have on Cox Campus. So of course you guys are welcome to use that as a guide if you don't have a current phonics scope and sequence of when to introduce these new graphemes. All right, so the next slide is just an example that we wanted to kind of show you all about of a teacher who's using the sound wall from Tools for Reading. And as you can see kind of in the picture that's on the right, she has uncovered the grapheme F because they are learning about the phoneme, but they haven't learned about the grapheme PH, right? So even though she's introduced the sound, she's only uncovered the grapheme F. And once she teaches the grapheme PH, then she will uncover that one next. So again, we just kind of wanted to show you can, when you're introducing graphemes on a sound wall, you can either add the grapheme cards as you introduce them, or you can do like this teacher did, and you can unlock or uncover them one at a time. All right, so something else that we want to make sure that you all remember is that, understanding the similarities between the sounds helps teachers to analyze errors in articulation. So again, when I say articulation, I'm talking about the way the mouth looks and feels when saying that sound, right? And so this can definitely be tricky because, again, looking at the slide, you see that the fish and volcano, they have similar articulatory features. And so this can definitely be tricky. So Sally's going to be talking a little bit more about that with our consonant articulation chart. But this will definitely help teachers to understand which sounds are commonly confused for students. And teachers who understand this are definitely in a better position to support students. So even though it is something that can be tricky and sometimes maybe a little overwhelming, it really is important for teachers to have an awareness of this in order to be able to help students and be in a better position to support students. And another thing that we want to make you aware of with when it comes to teachers being aware are talking about going back to building this sound wall with students, right? Toki, you can go ahead to the next slide. Again, it's important for teachers to try to build the sound wall with students and not just put it all up at once, right? And again, we're adding graphemes or we're uncovering them as they're introduced. But sometimes we might see an entire sound wall put up for older students, right? Like above third grade. Maybe they're receiving intervention, or maybe they're learning morphemes like TION or SION. And so you can use the graphing chart that McKinney shared earlier. And McKinney, you can go ahead and drop that one more time. You can use the phoneme graphing chart to kind of highlight how frequently these sounds are spelled using each grapheme. So you see those percentages on next to each grapheme. These percentages indicate the frequency of use in written English, right? And so on here, we didn't include anything less than 3%, but this is something for teachers to be aware of, especially for older students or students who might be struggling with spelling. It's really helpful for teachers to kind of be aware of the frequency in order to help students to kind of get to that goal of spelling independently. Because remember, the students should be using the sound wall when they're spelling independently. That's what we want them. That's the goal that we want them to get to for the use of the sound wall and why it's so beneficial for them. And then lastly, I just want to kind of remind everyone that when we're talking about a sound wall. It is very much, it's a tool to be utilized for students to utilize for practice. It's not just something to put up. If a sound wall is put up all at once without building or uncovering it with students, it kind of just becomes wallpaper, right, in our classroom. And so I just want to emphasize that point, that in order for it to work, you got to work it. So now I'm going to hand it over to Sally to talk a little bit more about teaching articulation of phonemes.
All right. So as we're looking at these mouth pictures that we see on these sound walls, we can really help children who struggle, that 80% of children who struggle with phonemic awareness. We can really help them by talking about something called MVP. So Toki, if you can go to the next slide. And what MVP stands for is the manner, voicing, and place of articulation. So if you'll click through those animations, manner is how we're producing the sounds. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. Voicing is our voice off or on, and the placement, where in the mouth that happens. So on the next slide, manner is really just talking about how we're making the sound, how our lips and tongue and teeth are working to get those sounds and to produce the sounds. So we talk a lot about stop sounds or continuous sounds. Are we stopping the flow of air or is it stretched out into a long continuous sound? And so an example of a stop sound would be the p sound. It's quick. You can't stretch it out as opposed to the sound that we can almost sing continuously. The continuant sounds are much easier for children who struggle to hear. And so we can be smart and pull those types of sounds together into words if we have children who are struggling with things like blending and segmenting. We also need to consider nasalization. So we have certain sounds called nasals, and those sounds can't be produced if our nose is pinched. And so that's the sound, the n sound, and the sound. And those are also really tricky sounds for children to hear. Voicing just means whether or not your voice box is on. We're going to do a couple of activities with this, but if you'll put your hand on your throat and you pronounce the p, you don't feel a vibration, but when you pronounce the b, you do. So is our voice off or is it on? And then we talk about the place of articulation. Where is this happening? Is it happening in the front of our mouth, in the middle of our mouth, in the back of our throat? So that's what we mean when we talk about MVP. Now, I'm not a speech pathologist, and so I didn't learn any of this when I was in college, but I know from very personal experience, my own child being a struggling reader, how critical this was to helping him get to being able to read on grade level as a fourth grader now. So let's look at the next slide. We have an articulation cues resource. Now, this is in draft form. It is not quite ready for Cox Campus yet, but it's good enough to share. It has been vetted by a PhD level SLP. So we feel pretty confident that it is close to being perfect, if it's not perfect quite yet. So this is for those of us who, I'm a kindergarten teacher. I wasn't taught how you explain the articulation of the sounds. So this resource will help you do that. So the way that it's organized is you have the place, manner, and voicing. It also tells you whether or not there's a partner sound. We'll talk about what partner sounds are in just a minute. And then there's a child-friendly explanation. So this is what your kindergarten teacher could say as she's introducing each sound and using the sound wall cards and building the sound wall. So that is a resource for you. And then on the next slide, this is another resource that we'll drop in the chat in just a minute. But this is our consonant articulation chart. We have one for English and Spanish that McKinney will share in a few slides. But for now, let's just kind of look at the way that it's organized. I think that kind of helps us to orient ourselves and to understand how this chart works. So when we look down the side, we start with the place of articulation and the lips together. That happens at the front of the mouth. And then as we go down the chart, it ends up in the back of the throat. So if we have the b sound, that is coming at the front of our mouth, and the h is at the back of our throat. So it's organized that way from top to bottom. And then we have across the top the way that we produce the sounds. If it's a stop, if it's a nasal, if there's friction involved, and glides and liquids. And we're not going to go deep into that today just for the sake of time, but there there for your reference. We also, as we talk about this, I want to draw your attention to that first box where it says the B and the P sound. Those are, we call those minimal pairs. There's very little change in articulation there. The B and P. If you look at my mouth closely, and if you get out your phone and use your mirror or your camera on your phone, this is why you need a mirror with your children. They're produced exactly the same. They look the same, but when you, the only difference is the voicing. So the only difference is you feel when you have your hand on your throat. So those are often very commonly confused with children for children. The most commonly confused are the sounds in the same box, but they can also confuse ones in the same column or the same row. And so when you're doing spelling analysis, that's really helpful to know. We also have a tissue on this slide because if you pay attention to the airflow, the stream of air, tissues can be helpful. Like, for example, the ch and the sh sound. If I say ch, you can see the tissue blows out. Ch. But if I say sh, it's a different airflow. So that kind of helps them. And for children who can't hear these sounds, these visual cues and how the mouth feels and how our voice box feels, these can all help them. They're like scaffolds for kids who struggle. So let's look at the next slide. And we will use our hand this time. Our tool is our hand. So if you'll put, Toki, can you move it to the next slide?
So sorry, having some technical difficulties over here. Give me just a moment.
Okay. While she's working those out, let's look at the B and the P, the two sound, the lips are together sounds. And everybody put your hand on your throat and pronounce those sounds. If you have your cell phone handy, look in that. Jordan, don't look in the mirror because you're driving. But if you say the B sound or the P sound, thank you, Toki, those are produced the same way in the mouth. The only difference is your voicing. And if you practice, if you say the D and the T, again, it's the same articulation. It's the voicing that's different. And children will often confuse these two sounds because they're so similar. I saw that Justin put something in the chat. Just a second. Oh yeah, more air comes out with the unvoiced sounds and less with the voiced sound. It's also really tricky. When you think about our 44 phoneme video, we talk a lot about clipping that schwa that we tend to put at the end of a sound instead of or I was taught that P says P instead of P. It's easier with an unvoiced sound to remove that schwa that we tend to add than it is with the voiced sound. And a tip that somebody told me a long time ago is if you try to think about it and be conscious and say the I sound, it's a little bit less intrusive for children. All right, so let's talk about our vowel valley. And that's on the next slide. The way that the vowel valley is organized is by how open or closed the mouth is. So airflow, when we pronounce vowel sounds, it's not obstructed by our tongue, teeth, or lips. The only difference here is how wide open our mouth is. All these sounds are voiced. And the vowel valley is this visual representation of how we articulate the sounds. So if we start on the left side of the vowel valley, our mouth is in a really big smile when we say the E sound. And as we pronounce the sounds in the order of the vowel valley, our mouth gradually opens until we reach the bottom in the short ah sound. And I'll demonstrate that in just a minute. And then you'll see when we climb back up on the right side of the vowel valley, our mouths gradually close and round. So if you watch the way my mouth does, I'll do the left side. All right, so we have E, I. Oh, hand on your chin can also be helpful here. E, I, A, I, ah. You'll notice my mouth opened more and more as I went down the vowel valley. And then as I go up, I move from ah to U, which is a rounded sound. My colleagues were kind of laughing at me earlier, but I put on lipstick intentionally to make it easier to see my lips as we made these sounds. So for the lady teachers in the room, that might be helpful. It is so difficult for Spanish speakers. Yes, I'm so glad you said that because we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And on the left side, we have diphthongs. These are glide. These are slides that kind of glide. You have two different mouth positions like ow and oi. Another really important thing to say here is that this is really difficult to distinguish depending on what dialect you speak. For instance, the way I pronounce the short I and sounds is very, very similar. Pen is the same. This is a pen, not a pen in my dialect. In Southern English, there's not much of a difference. And also we tend to pronounce the AU, the AWAU sound, almost as if it were a diphthong, saying all, whereas our mouth kind of moves a little bit. And when we think about, and I used this example the other day, I'm from Georgia, as are most of my colleagues on the call, and the Georgia Bulldogs are playing in the SEC championship. And if you pay attention to the way dogs is spelled, it's often not spelled with an O, it's spelled with an AW because that's how we pronounce it. And then there's a Boston accent with these vowels that is very, very, very different. So the point here is vowel pronunciation especially depends a lot on your dialect, but we don't want to correct children's dialects. We want to honor them, and we just want to draw their attention to, you know what, when I say this word, pen, I say it like this, pen, but when I spell it, I have to spell it with an E because that's the way it's spelled. So we just want to talk about the way we say words compared to the way we write words. All right, now on the next slide, we're going to get into what I think Haley was, somebody in here was saying, was talking about the 44 sounds of English. English has 44 sounds, 26 letters. Definitely not enough letters to represent all the sounds. That's why English has what we call a deep orthography, different spellings. And on the next slide, you'll see Spanish has a much more regular orthography. It's much more regularly spelled. It's a more shallow orthography. We have all of these vowels. And in Spanish, there are 5. So when we think about our children who speak languages other than English at home or as their first language, these are differences that are really important for us as teachers to know. Some children are coming to school with 5 years of experience with these English vowels, and others are coming and some of them they've never heard before. So they're going to need a little bit more time and a little bit more practice. So another thing to note here is that we have resources, and McKinney will drop them in the chat, for Spanish in particular, because it is the most common first language spoken besides English in the United States. But if you have so we have a participant from Canada, so maybe there's some French spoken there. mylanguages.org, if you are not a native speaker of that language, mylanguages.org can give you a lot of insight into the pronunciation of those vowels and how the differences are. One more thing to note here about articulation and about Spanish and English or different sounds is that even in our vowel valley and in our consonant chart that we have in Spanish on Cox campus, there's no way to account for all the different dialects of Spanish that are spoken. In our course, of our oral language course, we talk a lot more about this, and we even say, and on our Spanish consonant chart, we say that Spanish has the ch sound but not the sh sound. And when we created that chart, I specifically had 2 native Spanish speakers vet the chart. They were very educated. They were educators, SLPs, both from different countries, so different dialects spoken, and neither one of them caught the fact that sh is a Spanish phoneme in certain dialects in Mexico. So just know there's no way we can know all of the different languages and dialects spoken by the children in our classroom, but when we make an effort and honor those languages and understand why children may struggle a little bit or need a little bit more time to grasp these concepts, we're really doing the best we can and doing a service for our children. So we would encourage you to download those resources, especially if you have children who are non-native English speakers in your classroom.
Sally, before you move on, I just want to lift up a question from Jennifer.
Okay.
And she asked, is there a reason you have the diphthongs long A, O, U, and I in the valley and not with the other diphthongs?
This is the way that most speech Jennifer, that's a really good question. I am not a speech pathologist, but this is the way that most vowel valleys in English are presented. And I think it's because the vowel pronunciation is not as dramatic in the long A sound, O, your mouth moves a little bit, but it's not quite as dramatic as ow. But that's a really good question that I will ask our SLP colleagues at the Atlanta Speech School to help us answer. If anybody else on the call knows that answer, y'all feel free to hop in. All right, and if we can't get an answer for that, then we will turn it back over and talk about our session goals just a little bit.
All right. Thanks, Sally. So we have giving you a lot of information today. So we definitely want to make some space for you all to be able to ask questions in just a moment. But before we do that, we always like to kind of go back to our session goals to make sure that we basically have done what we said that we were going to do, right? So that we've helped you get a better understanding of the rationale behind using sound walls versus word walls, as well as exploring how to use sound walls as a part of a language-focused classroom environment. Because remember, all of our sessions this year are all about things that we can do in order to create more of that language-focused classroom environment. So we do want to make some space for you all to just reflect for just a moment before we get into any questions that you might have. So let's just take a moment to reflect on the next slide. We want you to think about all of the information that we talked about today, talking about this, speech to print connection that Alistair started with, and then going into the sound walls versus word walls that I talked about, and then the articulation that Sally wrapped up with. What is something that maybe you learned that aligns with your beliefs that you already have? Or maybe something that you're definitely going to take away from today. Maybe you have been using word walls and you now want to start using sound walls, or maybe something you want to add to your sound walls based off of what the information that we talked about today. So we do just want to take a moment for you guys to just share either in the chat, or you're welcome to come off of mute to just kind of talk with us about what you got out of today's session, what you learned, what aligned, what you'd like to take away from today.
Hey, this is Jordan again. I can just say that our district, our grades kindergarten, first, and second, they've all moved away from word walls, and we actually implemented sound walls this year. But learning this information is going to help us be able to better effectively use the sound walls and help teachers understand the purpose of them. So we're definitely headed in the right direction.
Awesome. Jordan, if you don't mind me asking, are you a teacher or are you a leader in any capacity?
I am an instructional coach for pre-K through first grade in Thomas County school system.
Okay, awesome. And so when you say that, you guys have you made the transition, how has that been received by teachers?
I would say we are still about 50%. Okay. We have several lots of veteran teachers that have been used to the traditional word wall teaching techniques. So I don't think that they fully understand the purpose of transitioning to the sound walls just yet, but we're actually in the Rollins Center cohort, and we're redelivering this information to our staff right now. So after this redelivery, I'm hoping that we'll have more people on board with actually using the sound walls.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jordan. We appreciate it. All right, Alicia says, adding images to transform word walls to vocabulary. Awesome. We are looking at transitioning into sound walls in our K through classrooms. So we are in the knowledge building phase. Awesome, Alicia. That's great. I think to that point of the images, it really is that those articulatory features, it really is a game changer for students and really helps them in being able to kind of make it concrete in their mind of spelling those words and sounding them out and decoding them. Any other thoughts that anyone wants to share? All right. Well then, seeing and hearing none, I will move right along. So we are going to have you to do a poll. This is always helpful for us to kind of let us know how we've done, things that maybe we need to do differently. So in just a moment, you should see a poll pop up on your screen, and we'll ask that you just take a few minutes to answer those questions. Let us know how we did, give us the feedback so that we can know what to do differently in the future, just to better support everyone. And then if there are any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Alistair in just a moment in order to help get some of these questions answered.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Ashley Gray, and I was saying, do you give credits for this class?
So we do. There, you will receive a certificate for the class, and that or the session, and that typically will be sent out, I believe, in the next 24 hours after the session is over. So yes, you will receive one.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. No problem.
Oh, I just wanted to add to that, and Toki, correct me if I'm wrong. Everyone, please make sure that you have your correct name so that you can get that certificate, or else we won't know who attended.
Thank you, McKinney. Yes, please make sure whatever name you registered under is the name that's going to show up on the certificate. So sometimes, people will register with a phone number. Maybe they're joining from their phone, and we don't want it to be a phone number on your certificate. So just make sure that the name that you want on your certificate is the name that we currently see. And if anybody needs to change their name, or just let us know and we can walk you through how to do that. And I see that Kathy said, using the sound wall as a tool to encode, taking the time to introduce the mouth images, keeping the goals in mind of having the students use the wall with independent writing. Yes, thank you, Kathy. We're so glad that you were able to take those things away. All right, I think we can go ahead and end the poll. Looks like it's slowing down a little bit. And then I just want to remind everyone before we open it up for questions about our next session. So our next session will be happening on February 29th. And that is all about phonics in the classroom. Same time, same place. So we hope that you will plan to join us on that day in order to learn all about phonics. And now I'll turn it over to Alistair.
So we just wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of time at the end for anybody who had questions. If you don't have any questions, thank you for joining us. We hope you join Cox Campus and use the resources that we shared today, and come back and see us in the next session on February 29th.